I can.
I can.
Yes, and I can hear you as well.
You can hear me?
Let's. Okay, so Kaya and welcome everyone to Archaeology Seminar Series. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that this seminar is being hosted from Wajak Bujar, and we're paying our respect to the traditional owners of this land and Noongar people. The next step is usually for me to find a way to move the slide. Yes. We have almost the end of our seminar series now. After this one today, we have one next week with Nathan Wright, who's going to be an online-only seminar, not in the room, people. And also we have a new surprise seminar from Patrick on the 11th of November, here and online. And that's going to be his PhD research proposal seminar. So we're going to have the title and abstract very soon on our Eventbrite page as well. Also a note that the seminar by Emma had to be postponed to next year. Okay, so we'll be back next year in a better room, I hope, as well. Reminder that this seminar is being recorded and it might be available on our YouTube channel. So for people also chatting and asking questions at the end, etc., all of this is going to be recorded and being shared online if that's what happened with this seminar. And now I can finally introduce the talk today, which is going to be Niah Dilkes-Hall, who's going to present us some aspect of the research that she's participating into in East Kalimantan in Borneo. And I will introduce Niah a little bit more formally. So she's an archaeologist who specializes in archaeobotany and specifically the recovering and analysis of carpological remains, which is just a fancy word to say all the fruiting parts of the plant. And she used that to inform interpretations of human-environment relationship in the past. She received the 2020 Robert Street Prize for the most outstanding PhD thesis at UWA. I had to say that, Niah. And that was for her research that was looking at the Aboriginal plant use and monsoon rainforest connections over 40,000 years of occupation in the Kimberley, Northwest Australia. After that, she subsequently worked on the history of Pacific archaeology as a research assistant in the Pacific Material Project. And she's participated in archaeological excavations in the Philippines, Timor-Leste, and East Kalimantan, which is the basis for the research she's going to present to us today, for the fellowship that she just received from the Forest Foundation, starting officially a few weeks ago. And so she's going to present us from her quarantine home, back from Queensland, where she worked on the material. So over to you.
Okay, so hello everybody. Just bear with me. Hang on. Okay. Okay, so hang on, a few more things to click. Share this screen, this one here. And then I just need to adjust something, share sound. Oh, hang on. Okay. Okay, we're getting much closer. So now I just need to click down here. Okay. One more second. That's not working. I'll click it again. Okay. Okay. So, can everyone hear me okay? I think you can. I can see some nods. Okay, great. Hello, everybody, and thanks for zooming in today. As Em mentioned, I'm joining you from my self-quarantine, having spent some time in Queensland. So it's pretty nice to see some faces, and I'm looking forward to seeing more faces at the end of this. I too would like to begin this talk by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from. I live and work on Wajak Noongar Butcher, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today I'm presenting a talk titled Archaeological Records from Sangkulirang-Mangkalihat Karst region in East Kalimantan, Indonesian Borneo. So it's kind of been advertised that this is going to be my forest postdoc, but it's not. I'll touch on that at the end. I'm giving an overview of Borneo, some previous excavations in the specific SMP region, and then looking at one particular site that we excavated in 2019. So just a couple of things to say. It is being, this presentation is being recorded, but it won't be released until the paper that we're currently working through reviews is out. And also of note is that there are images of human remains in this presentation, so feel free to perhaps zoom out if that's what you need to do. So, okay, that worked. Borneo, so I'm just going to touch on some background here. So Borneo is the third largest island in the world. Geographically, the island's divided by a central highlands that runs from the northeast to the southwest. The non-Indonesian parts of Borneo are to the north, and these are Brunei and East Malaysia. And so East Malaysia comprising the states of Sabah and Sarawak, and also the Federated Territory of Labuan. So Kalimantan is the Indonesian portion. It makes up 73% of the total island, and the 5 provinces are north, south, east, west, and central Kalimantan. So the island straddles the equator. This produces an intense tropical climate. In the lowlands, temperatures are 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, while at higher elevations, it can be quite a bit cooler. The island is defined by the classic 2 monsoonal seasons, the dry from May to October and the wet from November to April. The entire island sits within what you call a ever wet zone, with most areas receiving between 2,000 and 4,000 mils of rainfall. You'll just have to ignore that purple patch because that was the only map that I could find with annual rainfall. This equatorial climate with high humidity, hot temperatures and rainfall drives vegetation, and pterocarp forests dominate. Borneo's forests are some of the most biodiverse on the planet, home to more than 15,000 plant species. And Pterocarpaceae is a family of hardwood. It's associated with tropical climes, and over 300 species of dipterocarps are found in Borneo. So this map to everyone's right is shows the different forest systems and vegetative systems that occur in Borneo. Down in the south here, there's a combination of degraded lands, agricultural lands, either used for small or large scale agriculture, but this in combination with the peat forest swamplands has the capacity to produce some pretty serious fires. So fires are most common in September and October, and they're common around this time of year due to agricultural burn-offs and the burning of logging debris to clear the way for crops and livestock. So the image provided by NASA, this was actually taken in September 2019 when we were in East Kalimantan for fieldwork, and the effects of heavy smoke were indeed felt even much higher up where we were in this particular region here. So dipterocarp are known for being the tallest and most diverse trees in the rainforest in the world, but this also means excellent timber potential. So these photos are courtesy of our colleague Fallon. These images are taken just 3 years apart, 2016 and 2019, and it just goes to show the clearly rapid and devastating impact the onslaught of rainforest clearance is having in Borneo. So that's just a really brief look at modern Borneo. So now we're going back in time. I'm just going to try and change my video because it seems to be in the way of what I'm doing here. Okay, maybe not. So during the last glacial maximum, which was 18,000 years ago, a period of lower sea levels globally, Borneo was the easternmost point of Sunda. So the megacontinent of Sunda, being made up of Sumatra and Java, joined together with Borneo to the Asian mainland at the periods of lower sea levels. Then you've got this group of islands, Wallacea, in between Sahul, which of course is Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea and the Aru Islands. So the figures on the right show the transformation of the Sunda Shelf from the LGM through to the mid-Holocene as post-glacial sea levels rose. And the figure in the bottom right is showing what we are more or less used to seeing on maps today. So the large changes in land and sea area, coupled with lowered sea surface temperatures, severely impacted the Indo-Pacific warm pool by reducing its size and atmospheric convection. And this in turn has played out in palynological records, biogeographical and geological records for the region, suggesting that this last glacial period, which encompasses the LGM, attributed to a savanna corridor. So the savanna corridor was first proposed by Heaney, and it runs north to south and then southeast through the continent of Sunda. As you can see in the figure, the northern part of Borneo indicates ever wet conditions were maintained during the last glacial period, while the southern parts show evidence suggesting a relatively open and dry environments, which is sort of the basis of the argument for the savanna corridor, which filters into the next slide in terms of human migrations. So as a pathway for human migration, Borneo has always featured heavily, especially in terms of the first migrations to Sahul by 65,000 years ago. Many pathways have been proposed. This figure by Keeley et al. Summarises 4 main migration routes. And then this next figure, also by Keeley, but 2018, these are further developed migration routes based on least cost pathways and inter-island visibility models. The combination of shorter crossing distances and inter-island visibility along this particular route at 70,000 years ago makes it the most likely option for this human migration, well, earlier human migration events. So as we know from the previous slide, this coincides with the northern edge of the savanna corridor. But the oldest archaeological dates that are bracketing this route are from Niah, which is up here. I think you guys can see my mouse, so I'm hoping you can. From Niah, and then it's actually not on this map, from Wallacea, which is about over here, I think, in Papua New Guinea. Both dating human occupation to around 50,000 years, so not to the 70,000 years or older, as would be predicted from the 65,000-year-old date at Majababy in Australia. So despite its strategic importance in the role of human migration, significant archaeological gaps remain. And Borneo's prehistory is not well understood. What we do know largely comes from one archaeological complex, and that is Nia Cave. It's not the only one, but it is the main one. So Niah is located in Sarawak in the northwest coast of Malaysian Borneo. It has been an extremely productive archaeological site. In the late 1950s, the Harrisons identified deep and well-stratified archaeological deposits dating to the late Pleistocene. And since then, the site, and it's more of a complex than one site, has been the focus of several active archaeological programs. So the first human occupation at Niah is dated to around 47,000 years, and notably anatomically modern human remains coined the deep skull, dated to 35,000 years. So more recently, research has shown complexities in human occupations of the caves over time. It's also shown diverse foraging strategies, including arboreal hunting, changes in lithic artefact repertoires with an increasing utilisation of plant processing technologies. And probably something that everybody is aware of is the refined hunting technologies. They're employed on a broad range of animal species across a mosaic of habitats. So while Niah produces an incredible history that has been used somewhat on a regional scale, it is local. And what is known elsewhere on the island about human occupation is sporadic, and I will get onto a particular region just now. So elsewhere. So Niah, as you can see, is shown by the blue dot. And we are going over to this region of Borneo, and this is in East Kalimantan. The red circle itself is showing the Sangkulirang-Mangkalihat Peninsula that encompasses the limestone karst landscape as well as this Mangkalihat Peninsula. So the SMP is a special ecosystem. It stretches over 1.8 million hectares of land, and the porous karst landscape is upstream from 5 major rivers. And so this is really important for water filtration and the local hydrology. So the SMP is known for its unique and striking limestone karst topography, and due to its relative inaccessibility, the areas host high biodiversity of flora and fauna, with many species here found nowhere else on the planet. And importantly, it contains strongholds of dipterocarp forests that are an important habitat for the critically endangered orangutan. So archaeologically, this is, everybody knows this, the region hosts the world's oldest known rock art, with images dating to at least 40,000 years ago. And for this reason, the region itself is incredibly significant for human occupation. Now the SMP is a candidate for UNESCO World Heritage listing. And while it's a super important area and does contain the world's oldest known rock art, we don't know very much about what's going on there archaeologically. So the first archaeological sites I want to discuss really briefly are in the northern limits of the SMP region, and these are the Upper Birang River sites. And archaeological investigations were conducted at 2 cave sites and a rock shelter in the limestone massif in the tropical rainforest of the upper reaches of the river. So Karina Arafin's investigations show human groups frequent the Upper Birang River from the late Pleistocene onwards. Late Pleistocene to Holocene records from the UBR sites found little spatial or temporal change in raw material preference or types of tools manufactured over time. Increased cave utilisation by larger human populations over prolonged periods is suggested by her research. Evidence for versatile hunting practices showing broadening of subsistence strategies and proliferation of hunting and trapping of arboreal taxa, such as primate evidenced, and faunal remains further suggest people exploited various niches of the tropical rainforest environments. And the excavation of flexed inhumations and burnt human remains indicates that local forager populations in East Kalimantan were integrated into the wider social, cultural and ideological networks that were emerging across the region in the early Holocene. So now we move on to the French archaeological mission in Borneo. This was run by Jean-Michel Chazin and Luc-Henri Fege. And together they conducted 11 expeditions identifying 38 cave and rock shelter sites with rock art. So in addition to the rock art recording, archaeological excavations and test pitting were conducted by Shazeen and colleagues at a number of these sites. One site in particular is Lianzhong, and this is a site that we return to, so this is the site I'm going to focus on here. So it's got a pretty complex history. In 2001, Lianzhong's rock shelter was the subject of an initial sweep, an initial collection of surface remains, which included various ceramics and human bones. In 2003, the site was returned to, and where's my mouse? And these two squares were opened and excavated using pits anywhere from 10 centimetres to 40 centimetres in thickness. In 2005, the site was returned to again, and then these two squares, SA and SB, were opened. SA stopped at a depth of 60 centimetres as a complete extended burial was uncovered, and SB was dug to a depth of 3 metres, although bedrock was not reached. So the site was then returned to again in 2007, and these enormous trenches cross-cutting the site sunk to varying depths of 1 to 2 metres, and I can't seem to find any information on the excavation unit size that was used for this. And then in 2008, an area of 8 metres squared was excavated to a depth of 25 centimetres. So findings from these investigations include lapita-like pottery, human remains, and stone tools. These seem to be the focus of these excavations. Animal bones and marine and riverine shells are present and do occur in these assemblages, though nothing further has been published. And an occupation date of 10,260 years, calibrated BP, was established for the deepest square, which is that SB one there. So now that we have some previous archaeological background, let's just move straight on to the recent excavations that were conducted in 2019. And these were conducted under the ARC Future Fellowship, the Unknown Ice Age Artists of Borneo, that was awarded to Maxime Aubert. So we didn't just magically drop from the sky. I think it's a really important aspect of archaeological fieldwork that's really often overlooked, is the how. How do we get to the places that we get to? And a lot of this is encompassed by getting there. So the story actually begins in Jakarta in July 2019. And I flew from Perth to Singapore and then on to Jakarta, where I met my colleague, Tim Maloney, who's laughing his head off. So we had a good 3 weeks there in order to arrange visas, excavation permits, these obviously being crucial to fieldwork to go ahead. So we had meetings with important government bodies and officials, and we gave our passports over to get research visas. And apart from writing some groundbreaking papers together, we had some spare time on our hands. So we ate delicious food. We met with Pindi. We ate more delicious food. I checked my personal notes from this time, and I wrote, we eat, plan, check plan, knock things off plan, and repeat. We played pool. We refined our archery skills. We visited some malls. Tim would say every mall in Jakarta, but that was not the case. It was just a couple. We endured the worst 3 days of pollution on record ever anywhere in the world. And we did a little bit of equipment shopping, but the less we had to transport with us to Balikpapan, the better. So our hands were kind of tied in this way. But after 3 weeks, our visas and permits were granted. Maxime flew in and we headed back to the airport to fly on to Balikpapan. So And yeah, in the bottom photos, you can see what I mean about gear. We were already overburdened. So we flew from Jakarta to Balikpapan, got ourselves and our gear straight into minivans, drove on to Samarinda, arriving in the early hours of the morning. It was in Samarinda that most of our equipment and food shopping was done. So here, all Ace hardware stores were visited, along with every other hardware store in the area. The highest priority of this search was for embers, so bahasa for bucket. The perfect bucket, obviously, is a must for good archaeology. And with the equipment and food shopping done and completed, we made our way onto Sangada, which is a small mining town, and we made our final preparations there. And from Sangada, we then drove and continued our journey and headed to a small village called Hambo Batu. So this is Hambo Batu, and this is sort of the launching point for the SMP region. So once we arrived, our enormous amount of gear was transported onto boats. Max, Tim and myself piled into one said boat, which was captained by Pa Stefano, an extraordinary boatsman and all-round amazing man. And this boat was also navigated by Petros. So we set off up river. Now I'm really hoping this works. I'm just going to press this button. I really do feel like the videos capture the landscape better than any of the photos I took. So hopefully you can see them. They're not doing anything weird. And the last one. Okay, so hopefully you did hear some of the soothing dulcet tones of a two-stroke engine, and above that sometimes you can hear a roar of insect life, which is super incredible. Okay, camp life. So this slide is a snapshot of our camp life at Lianzhong. We slept in hammocks for close to 2 months. My lower back has never been the same. There was a pretty chilly, heavy diet, which I didn't mind so much, but my colleague Tim didn't agree with him too well. The food, however, you know, the food caught, collected, and the meals prepared for us on this little kitchen hearth were some of the best I've ever eaten in my life. In the top right, got the main shared living area. This is where we would meet, relax, charge all of our phones. This was sort of the technological tent. And the addition of a satellite meant we had some access to the outside world. And then in the bottom, this is where the ayam hutan was kept. So that literally translates to chicken of the forest. So basically camp life was incredible. We ate well, we bathed in the Marang River, and it was from here that we walked to site and back every day. So this is another aspect of underappreciated and underacknowledged part of archaeological programs is the walk to site. So I truly believe this is where you get a real feel for the area, you pick up knowledge you just can't access in the site, or worse, you know, in a lab if you're not part of the archaeological field work. So I said earlier, before we don't drop from the sky, and the same goes for the people in the past that we study, they were closely engaged with this environment around them, and these types of relationships are a really important part of our archaeological interpretations. So here's just a little bit of And on these walks, every day you notice something new. The plants, obviously, in the rainforest, for obvious reasons, grow at an incredibly rapid rate. But the pink mushrooms above, they weren't there one day, and then we had a torrential downpour, and the next day they had all just sprung up. It was just like magic. And this is the freshwater spring. So this flows from a lower section in the karst just beneath Lianjian, and it flows into the Murrung River. So for us, it provided our drinking water, and no doubt did the same for people in the past. Okay, this to the left is the first photo that I took at Lianjian. So welcome to Lianjian 2019. We spent around 2 months here conducting excavations. As mentioned before, this site was previously investigated by MAFPO. So for us, homogeneous sediments were excavated in arbitrary excavation units, and these ranged in thickness from 1 to 4 centimetres. And these were excavated within observed stratigraphic units as well. So we did our best there. Laser scanning and P-spotting was really important and was carried out throughout the excavation. All excavated sediments were sieved using 1.5 mil screens. However, features such as hearths, burials, and that were excavated separately following their own stratigraphic boundaries were sieved with 0.05 mil sieves. We had on hand an amazing revolving team of members who helped us sort and sieve all the excavated materials. During excavations, while we primarily used fine leaf trowels, human remains and other delicate artefacts of bone and shell were excavated with softwoods and bamboo tools to prevent any damage. So all the figures that you're going to see now were produced by Tim Maloney, and they are from the upcoming paper, Maloney et al., probably 2022 at this stage. We excavated 3 1x1s, A, B, and C, plus an adjoining extension to the rock shelter wall. So this is kind of hidden by this thing that I can't get rid of, but I'm pretty sure I'm pointing to the right spot. So our square B was positioned over the deepest square of the MAFPO excavations, and after putting trowel sediment, it was pretty clearly backfill. So the backfill was loose, very loose, well sorted, and contained cigarette butts and lolly wrappers, so really clearly backfill. So as we excavated the other squares, we sequentially removed the fill, and eventually we hit the bottom of the tarpaulin that lined the MAFPO previous excavation. And so from there, we continued to bedrock. So the really important here is that the wall itself of the rock shelter curves in. It's probably best shown here. So while you think it disappears and it would go away, it comes straight back out and crosses all the squares, except for a very small portion in square C, which was incredibly difficult to excavate. There's a short video if we've got time at the end. I'll go through it. So in total, 30 samples, either collected during excavation or handpicked from the wall, were submitted for dating. Bayesian modelling of the return dates produces 6 phases, fitting in with the 6 stratigraphic units that were identified during excavations. A strong hiatus between SU1 and 2 cannot be reconciled by our own excavation data, although direct dates on human remains reported by Guinea et al. 2016 suggest occupation around 5,600 years. So there's deposits of this particular occupation within the site, none that we came across. And the lowest date from square C returned a date of 16,000 years, 16,985 to 16,522 calibrated years BP. And the charcoal for said date comes from this gastropod heavy layer, stratigraphic unit 6. Okay, so this slide highlights some cultural trends. Faunal remains and freshwater shell are abundant in the most abundant in the earliest phases of the site. There's some examples of the faunal remains. So there's a large canine working way down, primate maxilla, primate mandible, and metacarpal fragment of a large mammal. Some examples of freshwater shell. So we've got two different types of gastropods. The apex is often removed for eating, burnt crustacean and freshwater bivalve throughout. So ochre is also present throughout the entire sequence. And although there's currently no visible rock art on the shelter wall, other than very modern additions, the wall is extremely weathered, and the old surface on which the art presumably is likely to have disappeared. And the archaeobotanical remains, obviously all of these things require further research, but the trends between charcoal and seed, they correspond very well, indicating that people were collecting botanical resources, bringing them back to the site for fuel and food. Okay, so a burial feature was excavated. Human bone and bone fragments were laser scanned, piece plotted and photographed across the 10 removals that we did for this feature. The burial is secondary, it's partially cremated, and differential treatment between the cranium and mandible. So the top A and B shows the burial in cross section, and also the cut shape along with the removal units. C shows the painted mandible. D, we have marine shell beads and primate incisors that are considered to be grave goods, and painted cranial bone before and after the fracture, and some calcaneous heel bone rather, some heel bone, and then some burnt bone from the lowest level of the feature. So 2 charcoal samples within the feature were dated. The first returned an age estimate of 7,574 to 7,460 calibrated years BP. And the second returned 7,586 to 7,482. So that's bloody tight. The preservation of this burial feature within SU2 sort of harks back to what I was saying. There's definitely some erosional processes going on within the site, but we just don't know what, so more research is necessary there. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, we're working on the revisions for this Liang John paper, and I spent a month in Queensland earlier this year with Tim going through the summary data. And now that we have the summary data, specialist research needs to be undertaken. So if anybody wants to do a PhD, certainly get in contact. There's an enormous amount of material here. But anyway, some key findings to be highlighted is the period of freshwater mollusk gathering in the terminal Pleistocene units. Interestingly, this occurs at Nia Cave and the Upper Birang River sites, who share this sort of freshwater foraging strategy, which is then superseded by a broader spectrum of terrestrial mammals. So Liang John fits in quite well to this regional trend. The mid-Holocene dates for the burial feature are important for identifying pre-Austronesian mortuary practices. And the shell beads indicate significant maritime connections to this inland site, which today is 190 kilometres from the coast via river routes. So this suggests coastal communities must have either had contact directly via travel from these groups to the coast, or indirectly via exchange up the complex network of river systems. And for me personally, the recovery of an amazing archaeobotanical assemblage is super exciting. So the assemblage contains both desiccated and burnt remains, and this will be analysed to shed light on people-plant relationships in the past and human environmental conditions through time. So that brings us to the next. So as Em mentioned, I've just recently begun my forest foundation Prospect Fellowship at UWA, and this will focus on the archaeobotanical remains from Lianzhong, of which, as I mentioned, there's heaps. So as you can see on the screen, this is a plant called Pangium edule. It's a toxic plant and it contains high levels of hydrogen cyanide. So the seeds, such as these in the third picture, and the fruit, in fact, you can only eat a tiny amount of it, must undergo complex processing techniques in order to leach out the toxins. And this occurs throughout the sequence at Lianzhong. So that's really exciting. Stay tuned for that in the future. And so to wrap it up, terima kasih to everybody. Many thanks to obviously Tim and Maxime at Griffith, Pindi Setiawan, and the various groups that we worked with closely on this project and will continue to work with closely in the future. But of course, the biggest thanks go out to the local crew members, because none of this would have been possible without your expertise, your rainforest knowledge, without everything. I'm sure I'd be down that sinkhole I fell down on the first day if it wasn't for you. So, terima kasih. Oh, do we have, what's the time, Em? Do we have time for this video?
Yeah, we have time, we have, yep.
Oh, there's lots of time? Okay, there's some time. This is not going to end well for me, I'm sure, but
Can only get deeper.
And so that's Tim digging those final units because his arms are longer than mine. I was often, always down there. And so that, thank you to Tim's long arms for getting that tiny spot of sediment. Terima kasih. Okay. So, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I'll stop the share. I'll stop the share.
Yeah. If anybody wants to put their camera back on for the discussion, people online who would like to ask a question, what I'll do is just ask maybe to some little chat to tell me that you would like to ask a question, and so I can take you in order, and also start with people in the room. Is there any burning question in the room? Maybe I should do this well. I was going to ask about...
point out that that's my music, not Tim's.
I'm going to ask the first question about the preservation of the archaeobotanical material. Is it mainly charring or other kind of situation?
So in the upper units, it's both. It's desiccated remains and charring. So that the combination of coming across those so quickly sort of halted me while I did want to run a flotation program. The desiccated remains stopped me from doing that. But it does seem that the desiccated parts are confined to the uppermost units, and then the rest is burnt. So charred, seed, nut and fruit, and then lots of charcoal. So there's those two lines of evidence, the charcoal and the karstological remains.
And were they all from combustion features or also within?
No, from throughout as well.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
With so many endemic species in the area, I'm wondering how you got a good reference collection?
Can you hear the question?
I believe so. I think Ben's asking about reference collection.
Yeah, I was just worried because there's so many unique species in that area. I was wondering how you were going to deal with that, whether you have to collect your own reference collection or whether you have access to good reference collections from the area.
Yeah. So it's the answer to that's probably a combination of both, Ben. Obviously, these excavations took place in a pre-corona world where the ideal, you know, the dream, the number one dream, getting a postdoc, number two, getting, you know, getting back to Borneo and collecting a comparative reference collection. So while I don't have a comparative reference collection myself, I did do some limited collecting while I was there. I have, Pindi has put me onto a good contact at the Herbarium Bourgeois in Yogyakarta, and through a botanist on the ground, through myself, through my own connections through botanists here in Australia and also working overseas, and then coupled with archaeobotanists who have worked in the region, there are reference collections available at UCL. Again, travel. So, yeah.
Because there's not a lot published that you could use, is there?
Well, no, and that's a lot of the plant processing and the data comes from not necessarily carpological remains, comes from starch. So that's another set of comparative reference collections as well. But there is, I believe, a carpological collection that is housed at UCL that was, I think, Christina Castillo collected. So, you know, that was back in the day, pre-corona. I was like, yeah, I'm just going to pop over to London and look at that. Not anymore. But the ideal, Ben, would be get back, get on the ground, get, you know, do botanical collection, do ethnobotanical survey.
So you need another postdoc.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I do.
Other question?
Any other questions? Oh, wow. No questions.
Are we allowed to ask a question about the burial, or is that top secret until publication?
You can. Tim might want to zoom in on this one, unmute for this one, if there is a question about the burial.
I was just wondering if you can say a bit more about what you think you've seen in terms of mortuary practice and treatment of the body.
No. Well, from what you already saw in the slide, there's some pretty amazing associations with ochre. So there's a pretty intense concentration of ochre on select remains. It's a secondary burial with partial cremation, which is a trend that's a bit more prolific in Iron Age burials and latter Holocene burials, and this one's much earlier, around the 7,500 to 8,000. So there's a lot of ochre. It's mainly consists of the skull and mandible, and not much else. Mm-hmm. And it's super cool. We did a really good, slow, meticulous job of excavating it, and it'll hopefully be in QSR press in the early next year, hopefully. There's some grave goods of shell beads that are quite cool that are throughout the site. Yeah, and it's a good snippet of some pre-Austronesian burial practices. It's quite rare.
Cool. I think there's a question about the beads particularly, so maybe you can continue on that. Is there any more that you could share about them, like the material and trade, which you touched about already, but can you elaborate on that?
So as far as is my understanding, the majority, all of the marine shell beads come from a maritime environment. So the thing with the region that we're working in as well is, and the more I read and see, and the more background reading and lit reviews I do, the word inaccessible, inhospitable, it comes up a lot, you know, and we've heard this, there's that ongoing narrative about people not living in rainforests, blah, blah, blah. Obviously that's not a thing anymore, and we're slowly chipping away at that. But the marine shell beads show it just by very virtue of being there, even if there was only one, you know, but there's not, there's way more than that. By virtue of being there, that there is this connection to the coast. So it would be interesting to do further research and survey in the region. I mean, as you can see from what I showed, that it's hard to get there, you know, and it's money, it's everything. It's everything that we as archaeologists deal with regularly. The future would be finding more sites, doing more archaeological excavation, fine-grained analysis is a must to that, and seeing whether we can link up any patterns here. You know, at the moment we've just got this couple of other sites, then the Upper Birang, and then a few other sites scattered around Borneo. So the research that has been done is quite limited thus far.
Yeah, and there was a question from Emily as well about how continuous the archaeobotanical remains were throughout the excavated deposit.
Yeah, and so they're all the way through. You know, you wouldn't expect it. You think, oh no, you know, this just surely cannot be. They are all the way from the top to the bottom. Obviously, there's more in places. The upper units made up of that Pangaean nutshell, you know, and then you run down the lines of whether the weight, how much is much, you know, and all of that. You know, you're comparing like with like. But there's seeds in the very final excavation units, so they're throughout, which is great for me.
If there's no other question, I have another archaeobotanical question, because you use some very good small sieve mesh. So have you already had time to estimate how much of the remains are actually part of these really smaller fractions? Did you capture a lot by using such a small sieve?
I have not, but that is definitely the first thing to sort of knock off on the list, because all of those specific removals with the much finer sieves are obviously separate to what's going on throughout. So that's going to be a great part of the analysis to actually see if, you know, if there is anything there. Because I mean, realistically, I did do a large amount of that sorting from the finer grain sieves while Tim was excavating the burial. And yeah, you know, I think that classic sort of like, oh, you know, you're using big sieves, you're missing all the tiny seeds. I get it, but I'm going to, you know, throw my hat out and say that there's no tiny seeds in there because I sorted it. I dug it, I sorted it, I sieved it, and lo and behold, there's we're not missing anything. So.
Yeah, I think tropical environments are not prone to produce really small seeds.
Exactly. You know, I was half expecting rice, you know, in a way, in those upper units. But no, and I mean, I haven't done, you know, the proper analysis yet, but from what I saw on the ground, from the summary data going through all those bags and then being back in Queensland last month, yeah, I'm not seeing that. That's not what I'm seeing at all.
Thank you. There's a question from Annabelle, and then I saw Tishen as well raising a hand. So I'll go with Annabelle first, who's saying, and I agree that it's really nice to see the logistic challenge as well. And so she's asking, what was the most complicated or tricky challenge you had to deal with for the project?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's many. Physically, I would say my knees. That was probably the end of knees as you know it, and lower back. I bet really it was hard on a lot of levels. You know, as we know, field work is super hard, you know, especially when you're working in remote places. This time for me, I was faced with a language barrier, which I am often faced with in Aboriginal communities as well here in Australia. But literally having one person, that guy, to talk to and converse with for an extended period of time is hard. You know, it's hard not to look around and be like, oh, hey, you know, and come back from site and have a big group discussion. You know, you're just sort of there. So that's my own downfall, and that's my bad, and that's all of Australia's bad for not learning the language of our closest neighbours. So that was an element, but also being the only woman there was not to say, you know, harass you or anything like that, but that was just a hard element. When Essa came, so she was the only other woman that came for, I think, a week and a half. Etta was with us. You know, I just, yeah, something about women and women, right? And yeah, that was a hard element too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry if I pronounced not correctly, but Tishan, you were raising your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. I have one question. Are the pungent seeds still being consumed in local communities? Because there seems to be records from near archaeological sites too.
Yes, and yes, I believe they are. So when we first started excavating them out of the site, I turned to Pastor Fano, the wonder that he is, and after recollecting his memory, he remembered that Pangeometrial does exist. At first he was saying that deer had brought it into the site, which was not the case, but he went down to the river and then collected some fruits. And I don't know, I always get a bit about trying toxic things that have been leached, so I didn't personally try it myself, but it was being consumed. Pastor Fano knew people who had consumed it, so it is still being consumed within local communities today. And it's often, I think it often turns up in soups, he was saying. It's a really important component of a particular soup that's consumed in East Kalimantan.
Cool. There's also a question from Helen asking if there is much ethnographic information on economic species.
So, Helen, yes, I think so. It's hard. So I've only recently been able to go through the literature, so that's my bad. But I'm gradually developing a picture of what's going on here. There are different Indigenous groups, and then with the Austronesian expansion I'm still working my way through the literature to find out that exact sort of colonisation history, then the colonial history that obviously impacted Indigenous groups and how that operates. I'm working my way through. The early ethnographic stuff, as far as I can tell, comes from Lumholtz. A Dutchman went through Borneo way back when, but I haven't had a chance to pour through that literature yet. But yes, there is ethnographic accounts. I just need to wrap my head around them.
Yeah, and linguistic skills might be a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot going on in Borneo today in terms of Indigenous groups, and even in the past, yeah, it's going to be, it's a ride trying to figure out what's actually happened, who's visited there, who colonised what at what time, who then gave that colony to someone else, you know, all the while trying to make use of Indigenous knowledge. So it's pretty difficult and complex.
Cool. So I think we don't have any more questions around, and we are going to 4 p.m. So perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much again.
Oh, thank you.
Presentation.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Cheers.
And see you all next week. And India and Emily will actually be hosting.
Yes. I'll press some buttons. Bye. Thank you.